Welcome to the Clinical Athlete Journal Club number 19. My name is Quinn Hennick. I'm a proud clinical athlete provider, and I am joined by Kevin McNamara, who is a physical therapist and currently completing a residency at Johns Hopkins. He's a longtime forum member and the one responsible for bringing the Journal Club to life. So thanks for being here as always, Kevin.
Absolutely, Quinn. Today's going to be a good one, I think.
I'm excited. So just so you guys know, if this is your first time, the impetus for these meetings, way back in the day, a smart guy named Benjamin Franklin started a weekly club that was called the Junto Club. It was a mutual improvement club. Basically, it was just a bunch of really smart people in a room discussing topics and issues of the day. It's kind of like this. But they had an important policy, and that policy was that all discussions would be conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. And we've adopted that motto in the Clinical Athlete Journal Club. So these meetings are conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. So we're all on the same team. We're all just trying to be less wrong. It doesn't mean we can't disagree and have discussion about it, but we're not necessarily in it to win it. We're in it to learn. So just keep that in mind. Today's topic is movement variability and injury. And as Kevin said, I am super excited for this, and I've created a poll because I want to get a feel for the room, and I'm launching that. So you should get a couple questions in front of you. First, who are you? Are you a clinician, student clinician, coach trainer, student coach trainer? Pop in and vote. I guess it's not really a vote. Number two is the concept or the term movement variability, is that a concept you had heard before this? Just curious. Looks like we've got about 50% clinicians, almost 40% student clinicians. Students, they're like, man, forget school. Oh shit. And then coach trainer, we got a few coaches and trainers, cool. And we've got a couple student coach trainers, or at least one. And then most of you, it looks like 86%. I'll end this poll and just show you. I don't have to read it to you. Share your own. So most of you guys had heard of movement variability. Andy says, go students. That's right. Go students. And if you hadn't heard of movement variability, that's all good, because that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to just, if I X out of this, is that away from the screen, Kevin, on your end?
No, not yet.
It's still on the screen?
Yeah.
Still? Stop sharing.
I can minimize it, but.
Okay. All right. Well, for some reason, if it's still in your face, just X out of the poll if you can. All right. Because I want to share my screen. I'm just going to pull up the papers. And if you didn't get to reading the papers, don't feel guilty. It's all good. We're going to discuss 3 of them. And I'm going to give you a few more if you want to dig into this topic. And Kevin, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the first paper, the one that we called the main paper, was this. And it was shortest, and that's pretty much the reason why I made it the one. It's like, what one are the most people going to read? It's usually the shorter one. So it doesn't mean it was any better, but this was one of them. And this was another. And this is a classic. You might have looked and say, oh, this is all the way from 2011. Still very much relevant now. And I'm probably going to spend a lot of my time talking about this one and the model that they used. And then the third was here. And this one is a lot more recent, looking at movement variability in regards to landing injuries. So kind of a specific task. But before that, let's define some of these terms. So these papers none of these 3 papers were studies per se, meaning they didn't have experimental groups. They were kind of a synthesis of the research on this particular topic. And it's a complex topic if you guys hadn't figured that out. So let's start with some definitions here. We can define movement variability in this paper here, and I always mispronounce his name, I'm sure, but the Sturgill, any idea there, Kevin? No. Okay.
Sergio.
Let's say
Yeah,
Sturgio. I like that better.
sure.
So movement variability, the normal variations that occur in motor performance across multiple repetitions of a task. Definition number 2, the ability of the motor system to reliably perform in a variety of different environmental and task constraints. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And movement variability is a topic that I'm enamored with because it makes a lot of sense conceptually, but it's really hard to model because there are inherent, almost seemingly contradictions in variability in regards to, well, is decreasing variability good? Is increasing variability good? Is it beginner to expert? Like, who's got variability and who doesn't? And it seems like there's contradictions no matter where you look, but conceptually it can make a lot of sense. So it's just really hard to model and then have some type of actionable takeaway and kind of clinical relevance. And it's really fascinating to me in that regard. So I'm going to stop sharing this paper and I'm going to share my Google Doc that I made here. Because there was a model in the Sturgio paper, and it's this optimal variability model. And there's a model that you'll see often that's this kind of inverted U model. So conceptually, let's say we're looking at this one. Probably shouldn't have done that. Okay, we've got performance on the y-axis, increasing, variability going this way. And variability, again, meaning this concept of repetition without repetition, meaning each repetition of anything, of a task, is slightly different in how it's performed. And the reason that happens is because of this. DOF, I shouldn't have abbreviated that, but that's degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom defined here. Essentially, all of the independent ways that the body could move in this particular way or perform this task. And think about shooting a basketball, throwing a ball, lifting something. The degrees of freedom are all of the different combinations that you can move your joints and position your limbs and interact with the environment to get that task done. And so what we've talked about in the past is, from an intervention standpoint, what we do a lot of times is we constrict or increase the bandwidth of degrees of freedom purposely. That's kind of an intervention. We decrease we increase the constraints, decrease the degrees of freedom if we're trying to isolate a certain area or a certain aspect of a movement. We let those constraints open so that we increase degrees of freedom to kind of let the body figure it out. And so that's what we do on an intervention standpoint a lot of the times, whether we realize it or not. But that's one of the reasons that movement variability exists in the first place, is because we just inherently have almost an infinite amount of options that the body can use. And from all the way from the complex pattern all the way down to, the joint by joint and the tissue level. So when we try to model movement variability, it was thought in the past that differences in how you perform a task was actually an error. Like, you didn't want that because you wanted the task to be refined and efficient over time, and you wanted to absolutely minimize variability. So in a perfect world, zero variability. But what we learned through motor control research and motor skill acquisition research was that no, variability can be synonymous with adaptability. So the organism being variable allows it to take on the stressors of the environment and the new tasks and the complexities therein, and then adapt, because the movement solution that worked in one environment may not work in another environment. So we actually said, oh, okay, well, movement variability is good. Well, then what we see is there's a U-curve component to it, as in there's kind of a sweet spot, or that's how they're modeling it. So over here, let's say we have a kid who's learning to ride their bike. And if you guys remember when you first got on an actual bike, no training wheels, you've never got on a bike before in your life. And actually, they're going to be over here on this end of the spectrum with a lot of variability. So you get on the bike, and there's all of these degrees of freedom that you have to manipulate. There's a ton of noise, and you can't control any of that, and there's no learning. It's too complex. Well, over here on this end of the spectrum, you have, let's say you have that. What do you do, or what do I have a lot of people done in the past? Well, they slap on training wheels. And what does that do? That constrains the system. That decreases the degrees of freedom, right? So now you just get really good at being able to ride in a straight line. But at least you learn how to pedal, you kind of learn how to steer. But that shifts you to this side of the model where variability is decreased. But notice performance is still kind of low, whether you have a very constrained, restricted system, or if you have a system that's got too much noise, too much variability that you can't control. Over time, hopefully the goal is that you can wean off of the training wheels and your variability actually increases again. But look what performance does. So what does this look like? Well, it looks like a kid who can ride without training wheels, who can kind of like on purpose do one of these, just kind of zigzagging, can ride on variable terrain, can ride in the city, navigating the environment. So now this person has found this balance of what is termed functional variability, meaning they have enough options now to be able to adapt to environmental or individual or task constraints, and performance will go up in that respect. This model is what you'll see, but obviously it's very simplistic. And so in that Sturgeon model, what this doesn't explain is, let's say you have like Michael Jordan, for instance, who his outcome is predictable, meaning the ball goes in the basket quite a bit, but the way that he can do that from a myriad of different positions, fading left, fading right, it looks like he has like a lot of variability, but yet it's very consistent. So that's the kind of the contradiction, and the paradox is like a lot of variability is good in some ways, but then it's not good in other ways. But he's very consistent, so he has less variability than beginners when it comes to certain aspects of the movement, which we'll get into with the Hamill paper. But then other aspects of the movement are more variable than a beginner. That's what's difficult to wrap your head around. And that's where I think this model here from the Sturgeon article does a better job of explaining, where you have randomness that's very unpredictable on the x-axis, and you have this more rigid system. So in this respect, you have the kid who just learned how to ride a bike, who just jumped on the bike with no training wheels, no nothing, over here. It's completely random in their coordination patterns, have no control of degrees of freedom. Okay, let's slap some training wheels on that kid. Here you go. Now I've got a nice predictable pattern. I know exactly what I'm going to get. We know what degrees of freedom are constrained. But what happens here is that your ceiling is affected, right? You're not going to learn. There's going to be a point where you're not going to make any more type of adaptation. So again, over time, what we're looking at is this chaos pattern. And what I thought was so interesting is a lot of people equate chaos with randomness, which is not the case. Chaos has a pattern. You just have to zoom out, and you need enough data points to be able to see it. But now this is the kid who can ride with zigzagging on different terrains, can navigate the environment. This is Michael Jordan shooting mid-ranges from anywhere on the court, fading left, fading right, eyes closed. And I thought that conceptually, it helped me better understand that paradox of the balance between more variability, less variability, more rigid, less rigid. But I'm going to stop there because people are chiming in. And Kevin, I want to get your thoughts on the papers or anything that I've said.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll follow up just kind of on the last point you made right there. And I think kind of framing this discussion, the important thing to kind of get across is that there's a difference between low outcome variability and like low movement variability, right? Because we talked about this even in the first paper where we're talking about endpoint variability in seasoned competitors is going to remain consistent, but that's not because they lack movement variability in getting to that end point. What we actually see is with seasoned performers, there's actually more within trial variation getting to the same endpoint than we see in inexperienced performers of the task. So that's important. I think I would agree with you very strongly there in making that distinction between low outcome variability is not synonymous with low movement variability. In fact, it's more variable in seasoned performers than someone who is relatively new to the task. Yeah. I think the other way to kind of frame this, I like spectrums just because I think that they're a little bit more representative in like the real world, and thinking about, this sort of sweet spot between how much variability is enough. And I've heard Doug Katijian talk about this. And if you think about like a heart rhythm, something like asystole, which is a very rigid system where there's no change, no variation at all. It's just a flat line, right? And then you have something like atrial fibrillation where it's complete up and down everywhere, tons of variability. They're both lethal rhythms. So it's just kind of framing the spectrum from maximum variability, still lethal, rigid, no variability, still lethal. I think framing kind of the endpoints and then maybe working our way in is a good way to kind of think about this as we move into, what do we exactly do about it? Where do we kind of intervene versus not?
I muted myself. Okay, I'm back. Because there's a couple really good points in the chat. And one of the questions was, well, wouldn't constraining the system or like training wheels in that example have a boost in performance pretty much right away? And the answer is yes. So like I said in the beginning of the conversation, we purposely constrain tasks and environments and individuals to get the movement solution that we're after. It's just that, what is your goal? Is your goal to just ride with training wheels for the rest of your life? And if it is, then training wheels it is. Your performance will boost to a certain point where what do training wheels constrain? Well, they constrain your ability to ride on different terrains. You're not going to go mountain biking with training wheels. You can't maneuver quickly. So there's going to be a buffer. There's going to be a ceiling to that performance. And if that's okay with you, then that's totally fine. But these models, to your point, Kevin, I had some limitations here. One limitation of both of these models is that they don't account for the purposeful constraints-based coaching that we use to kind of develop the chaotic bandwidth. So how much of this do we actually want? How much chaos and how wide do we want this bandwidth? For somebody, for a sniper, may be different than a basketball player. These types of models also assume linearity. And I think that's one of the points that kind of you were making there, Kevin, is like, this is a sliding scale. And just because you're over here one day, very rigid system, that doesn't mean you're going to be there forever. If we intervene and get the outcome that we want, that doesn't mean that, oh, that person's just at this new level now. So these types of models assume linearity when maybe this should be a double-sided arrow, and this side too. But what does George Box, the famous statistician, always say? All models are wrong, but some are useful. So it's kind of whatever you want to, the mental model that resonates with you. But then to your point again, Kevin, I've had here that this model, this optimal variability model, does not account for the endpoint versus coordinative variability. And I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to pull up the, so real world option of having too much variability in movement options. Yeah. Well, I mean, riding the bike was one.
What is a real world example of having too much variability? Like we said, atrial fibrillation, where there's just all sorts of different signals going off in the heart. and it's not conducive, you die if it's not corrected, you know, or something like maybe not atrial fibrillation, but you know, a very chaotic heart rhythm.
Well, we can go to the papers. So the Norden paper, or actually the Sturgis paper, talked about ACL deficient versus ACL reconstructed knees. And we can see this kind of in the pain research, low back pain, patellofemoral pain, where you're experiencing pain, the body tends to sometimes constrain the task or constrain the variability, as in like you're almost guarding. So you have less variability from rep to rep in movement to kind of find. And that's what they found in ACL deficient knees in the paper that they discussed in the Sturgis paper, which kind of makes sense. Like the body senses that there's an injury there. It kind of closes down the degrees of freedom. After the reconstruction, though, they found that there was an increase of variability in gait versus healthy's control group with no ACL. And I thought that was really interesting because now the organism has a more intact system, but they lack some of that proprioceptive feedback, or that's what the some of the discussion was centered around, which was interesting. How about shooting a gun, shooting an arrow, shooting a basketball? If every repetition is different, your outcome is going to be variable. So think about the outcome as you think about movement variability. What parts of the task can be adaptable, and what parts of the task, the endpoint variability, are really important to have a consistent outcome? So in shooting a basketball, if you have the ball in a different place in your hand every single time and you follow through in different places, the outcome may be variable. But if you're more consistent with the placement of the ball and your follow through, now your legs can be variable. You can fade back, fade left, fade right, but you've got some type of kind of funnel there. And so you think about different parts of the movement that affect the outcome if you have quote unquote too much variability. I mean, learning to walk. Think about a kid that they're managing all of the new degrees of freedom that they have no idea how to control. So that's an example of variability. Every time they get up and try to walk, it looks like something different versus somebody who is put inside of a suit that walks for them would be like the ultimate rigid system with no variability, right? There's learning that can occur in both phases. It's just slow. And so babies don't understand English, so we don't coach them, or we try to constrain the environment so that they learn, right? What about other examples? I mean, let's see if people are throwing them out there. I'll stop sharing. Anything? Yeah. So, okay. This endpoint variability, I think, is a really good place to be. I think it'll anchor some things. So I'm going to pull that up. Kevin, if you see any questions in the chat that are good to jump out there,
Yeah,
throw them out there. Let's see. Okay. This was really good. This is the Hamel paper, the first one. So here, to illustrate the difference between endpoint and coordinated variability, there was a paper on pistol shooting where the experts and between experts and novices. And they found that expert shooters had less endpoint variability, or the ability to hold the barrel of the pistol steady. So that was kind of my example of holding the basketball, than the novices. So they actually had, in that respect, decreased less variability than novices. Damn it. On the other hand, they had increased coordinative variability between the shoulder, elbow, and wrist in expert shooters that was greater than novices. So what that tells me is that novices were super tight and they were trying to grip They were probably nervous. And so they were like tensing their body. And what that did is it actually probably made the barrel of the gun move more. Because sometimes the more tense you are can kind of have a ripple effect. So they're not actually able to have that fine-tuned control. Whereas the expert shooters were a little bit looser at the elbow and the shoulder. So they're kind of finding that spot, and in turn allows them to put the control where they want it to be, which is the barrel of the gun. So I think that really helps too. And that's this model here, or the chaos model that I showed you, doesn't really account for this endpoint versus coordinative variability that I think is an important point. What are people saying?
Let's see. We got a couple questions here. I mean, the chat box is going off like crazy, so I can't even keep up on that. So.
Good. Remember, guys, use the Q&A box if you really want to get a question going. Because the third paper that we talked about, and again, if you didn't read all three, I totally get it, but I would encourage you to, because some of you guys are asking for examples, and the
third paper was very good with, and I also think that provided a pretty good indication on how we can actually maybe try to start to objectify some of this stuff when we're talking about the way that they accommodated or did not accommodate to the changing in tasks demands. So I think that's definitely a paper to, if you guys did not get to it, we can probably discuss that a little bit here too, but
yeah,
that's another good one to kind of just give you a couple examples on what exactly we mean, or what is being, what is meant when we're talking about accommodating to task demands. And it gets into the injury overuse hypothesis, which the Hamill paper touches on as well.
Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, we can go into that, I think. You want to start with the Hamill paper?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, so essentially, like Quinn was kind of saying here, we have this idea of endpoint variability and coordinated variability. And as it relates to the injury overuse hypothesis, essentially what we're seeing is that coordinated variability is utilized as a good marker for overall system health. So an increased variability is no longer really associated with decreased skill levels or injury and health. It's actually kind of the opposite. So the path to frailty or injury, the Hamill paper puts forward, is identified in this idea that it's a loss of variability, particularly in something like coordinated variability, which is the way that individual segments or joints are organized to complete the goal task. That is actually more indicative of a system that is maybe more injury prone or less healthy. So I think if we can kind of move into figure 1 on the Hamill paper.
I can share my screen. Or am I sharing it already?
I don't see it yet, no.
Okay. Figure 1.
There it is right there. So it's just this idea of kind of bandwidth, where if you're looking at reduced variability, as that bandwidth gets smaller and smaller, or the interjoint or intersegment coordination becomes less and less, it's this idea that we reach this threshold where, because the system has lost the ability to appropriately distribute load through a myriad of segments or points, it reaches this point of sort of failure. And this is something that we talked about last week as well, when we were talking about a dynamic systems approach to injury. But it's this idea that as system variability is decreased, or as we lose movement options to disperse load, we run into this potential injury threshold, which is it's demonstrated pretty nicely in this figure here.
So you become, to bring it back to that model, we had random, we had periodic, was the nice looking clean circle, and then we had chaos. And what this model is showing here is that we start to become rigid. The system starts to lose that variability, and it starts to be very essentially predictable in its patterning. And like to Kevin's point, the hypothesis is, well, if we don't have the ability to kind of absorb and adapt to different stressors that perturb the system, and we just have one rigid way of performing this task, biologically, we could just be kind of overloading and having the same strain patterns through the system, which we would think with runners, what do runners complain a lot of is patellofemoral pain, tendinopathies, nebulous diagnoses like IT band syndrome. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, to their point, and to the point that's always missed, the problem with saying that this is a cause of injury, number one, it's very clinically, measuring variability is difficult. And then number two, these factors all kind of interplay. So somebody can have a rigid pattern, but if they slow cook their training and they're very, very smart with their progressions, maybe it's never a problem. And, if somebody triples their training load in a week, then it maybe variability is washed out. It doesn't actually matter. It was simply too much work, period. So, all of these factors have dynamic interplay. There's never one thing, but this is a nice model to kind of show you what we're talking about. And Kevin, you want to talk about the Norden article? That was the third one, because it's now this concept with landing.
Yeah, so we can kind of move into the Nordic article a little bit here. So essentially what they wanted to do was they wanted to provide some sort of a way to objectify this talk about movement variability, system stability versus not. So they were looking at sort of kinematic and kinetic variables in something that they just used a double leg drop jump and a single leg drop jump. And essentially they just wanted to see how the ground reaction force, which was the primary thing that they were kind of monitoring, was distributed, or how the system sort of responded to increasing stress, which they just sort of utilized varying jump heights to increase the load going through the system. And what they found was, if we kind of roll down into, where is it at here? I thought this was helpful because it provided some sort of way of objectifying how the person is dealing with stress. It's on table 1, so the load accommodation strategy classifications. Essentially what they predicted was that as overall load into the system increased, meaning that they either increased the jump height or they manipulated mass, there would be some sort of accommodation witnessed through shifting load throughout the body. And essentially what they found was the inter-individual differences in accommodation to the applied stress were categorized into negative biomechanical, where there was decrease with the applied stressor, super Newtonian, where the person did not account for the added stress at all. But what they found was that the individuals either completely accommodated or they completely ignored the applied stressor. And what they took away from that was that load accommodation provides a framework that accounts for the sources for inter-individual variability. So depending on how the person is going to manage that load, that is what influences the motor strategies that they come up with. So motor strategies that reduce the ground reaction force, which in this case we would have considered a positive biomechanical, something that was fully accommodating, is likely a result of perceived danger to the system. And that occurs through movement pattern adjustments. So the idea here was that those subjects that were more accommodating to load had more strategies and options for handling the stress coming into the system versus those that were not. And the idea that a system that is not accommodating or does not account for the increased stress loses movement options to handle that stress overall.
And so trying to bring this back to applicability, because it also sounds like decreased variability, again, it's kind of like, well, decrease seems bad. Consistently decreased variability is bad. It's more so just what is the goal, I think. because let's take these jumps. In practice, you could have somebody purposely land differently. You could tell them to land differently on purpose to purposely put load through the system in different ways. So a drop landing, for example, and provide them with options. Like if you expose their body to different options, in this case, we're kind of forcing it upon them. Well, at least they've experienced it. The more they experience a certain stressor, perhaps the more they are to actually take it on in their bandwidth of movement solutions and their repertoire. They've never experienced it. They don't even know that it was an option. Then maybe they don't even pull it out. And so examples, doing a drop landing task, purposely cueing, I want you to spend as little time on the ground as possible. So you step off a 30 centimeter box, boom, decrease ground contact. That's the goal. So that's one way. But what does that do? That's going to probably decrease jump height. So you have to choose what's important for this athlete. Number one, from a performance perspective, what are you trying to work on? If you're a basketball player who needs a rebound and you got to get up fast, it doesn't matter if you can jump high. If you're too slow to get up there, somebody else is going to get the board. So you can work on decreased ground contact for one particular training day or a set or even rep to rep. Another rep could be, I want you to maximize jump height. I'm not going to tell you how to do it necessarily, but I want you to figure out what helps you jump the highest. And I could use like the My Jump app or something to measure that. But what that's going to do typically is they're going to spend more time on the ground and they're going to have probably a deeper counter movement to jump absolutely higher.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about this paper is that what they found was the more stressful the situation or the task that they were asked to do, the less inter-individual variability they presented with.
Yep.
Meaning that this person the more stress they were exposed to, they lost those movement options, or there was sort of this freezing of these degrees of freedom. And I think this is an interesting direction to take the conversation, because it now becomes to us, as clinicians, as strength coaches, rehabilitation professionals, what is it that we think may be limiting this person's ability to maintain those degrees of freedoms or maintain that movement variability, that coordinated variability as stress climbs in a certain task?
Well, it could just be the fact that, you're right. So as they increased the jump or the landing height or the takeoff height, as they stepped off a higher box, variability decreased, as in their landing strategies looked more of the same. As they did heavier, so they loaded the more load, same thing. The landing strategies became more of the same. One of the strategies was jumping from a higher box. They extended the hip and the ankle. So they essentially tried to reach the foot to the ground.
Yeah.
To decrease the height.
Impact, yeah.
But so my point, as I was talking about giving them like explicitly cueing different ways to do something on purpose, is because what if they have to land with those forces in a game, but they have to use a different strategy than what their body goes to default with? Let's say they have all the individual constraints. They have the strength, they have all these things. They just don't use it. All they do is land with rigid knees or whatever it is, or they land really deep. They land too deep and they take too much time to get back up for another jump. What I was suggesting before is that you could explicitly expose the athlete to different options. So even though their default, because in the study, they're not coaching them, they're just observing. Right. So what they observe is the default is decreased degrees of freedom, decreased variability, try to dissipate ground contact forces, but you're not always going to be able to do that. So my thing is you could land in a really deep squat on purpose, and then come out of the landing. So I purposely want you to land deeper than you typically would. I want you on this set to land with minimizing ground contact. On this set, I want you to land and maximize your jump height on the rebound. So it's different ways to dissipate the forces. The problem with that is you don't get the best of any of the worlds because you're working on being a generalist. So there's always give and take. Somebody made a great point earlier that sometimes constraining the system yields the best performance if the task is very specific, or at least in the short term. And that's true. So if that's what you need at that moment, that's what you take. If you're training for more general qualities, maybe you open up the options a little bit.
Well, it's like we talked about, we've come back to this point several times now, but this idea of, if we're talking about maximum speed and change of direction or cutting, having that stiffness through the plant leg is what's going to get you to make that cut at the best performance. Like if we're going to frame it from a performance perspective, that's going to be the quickest way to initiate force into the ground and change direction. So maybe it comes a little bit more of a semantical war on like what exactly are we determining as optimal?
So that's so a lot of these questions in here are like, how do we define bandwidth? How do we define optimal? That's the problem with these concepts. I think, guys, first of all, if you haven't yet, read all 3 of the papers, because some of these questions I think maybe will be answered, but at the same time, you almost want to use this as more of a kind of a conceptual framework, a mental model, not necessarily the nitty gritty of when the rubber meets the road, I'm measuring variability. That's not necessarily where we are with this concept from even a research standpoint, let alone clinically. But it's a mental model. The outcome of whatever activity seems to not be where we want it to be. Is it because this person is, as you're observing, too rigid in their strategies? Perhaps you're cueing them to try something different, and that changes the outcome. You say, okay, maybe I just need to open up the solutions a little bit, give them different options. And that's essentially what coaching is. Paul made a good point. He said that a lot of this may be controlled by the brain. And actually, yeah, one of these papers, I think it was a Sturgio paper, explicitly talked about some of the central mechanisms. We've got some hands up too. I'm going to unmute Leah. I don't want to catch you off guard, but you should be on. You might have to unmute yourself.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I have a pretty good real life example of limiting variability in how it relates to injury. So I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of examples people will be like football players, and how high school, specifically high school football players how they train in the training room. So they do a lot of power cleans, and they do a lot of squats that aren't to full depth, right? They'll go to just above parallel, because like an old school way of thinking is that like, okay, they don't need to do that because they don't do that on the field, right? But what that's doing is that is limiting their variability of movement. And that could be a reason why we see more adductor strains and maybe more hamstring strains in men, because in high school like lifting programs, they're not training the full range of they're not training in all the degrees of freedom that are available to the people to the athletes, when we know that, the adductors are really active in the bottom of a squat. So that could be a real world example for some people that are confused on a couple of things, maybe.
Thank you for, yeah, no, it does. Thank you for sharing that. And it's a great,
connect a couple of dots for people maybe.
I think it does. And the weight room is a great example of this. And I'll give you guys, because I know coaches who are taking these concepts and applying them in the weight room. And what that looks like is kind of what I was saying with the jumps. So let's say they're doing lunges. In the program, it will say lunges, but every repetition, or at least every set, has to be different. So let's say set by set. One lunge is you're going to lunge forward, but we want your shin to come forward on this set. And then one set of lunge where you want to kick out really long, where your shin almost has a positive angle the other direction. The next set needs to be fast as you can. So they're exposing these athletes to different angles, different force vectors, basically just throwing out constraints and saying, okay, do it like this, pick a different one, rep by rep or set by set. And I'm going to say that again, what you're doing is you're exposing them to a broad range of stressors, which, Leah, to your point, the more the better probably for a generalist athlete who's using the weight room to get better for their particular sport. The downside is you're not going to squeeze out the gains of any one biomotor capability. So I know some coaches who are all in, literally every rep and every set is different. I'm kind of more in the middle, where I think that you can have more of kind of a constrained task like back squats, traditional progressive loading back squats, but you can do drop sets differently, wide stance, fast, pause to different depths. Same with lunges. So those things, I think you can bring in both worlds, but that's essentially what this might look like in a weight room, is that you literally just purposely have them do different variations of the movement.
Yeah. I mean, it all comes back to, what's the intent, what's the modality, and what's the person in front of you lacking. So I think if you frame it that way, you can pretty much configure or build training programs, whatever you want to do, just as long as you're keeping in mind what the intent is. And we have an understanding that, we're maybe doing some of these drills, not necessarily to drive fitness adaptations, maybe more to just build sensory motor competency or expose someone to patterns so they can maximize some of the variability that they have across.
Absolutely. And another point that I should probably make is I'm also talking about movement variability in the types of movement, which some of the papers also talk about movement variability to end up at the end goal. I know that was kind of jumbled, but two different trains of thoughts there,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Variability in the sense of exposing them to lots of different stressors and different strain patterns and different ways of moving. It's not like that lunge example, I don't care how good they get at a lunge, but it's the fact that each repetition of the lunge stresses their tissues differently, right? Yep. Versus the pistol example.
Yes, exactly.
We're talking about variability from repetition to repetition of that very specific task.
Yes. Yep.
And you could do the same with snatching. So look at the best weightlifters in the world. It's repetition without repetition. You think of that quote. It's from if we can't have a motor control talk without quoting Nikolai Bernstein and saying repetition without repetition. But even an expert blacksmith is never going to swing that thing the same twice. But the outcome is very consistent. It's the Michael Jordan example. The ball goes in the basket, but the way he does it looks very different from repetition to repetition. That's that paradox.
Yep.
And I think that gets into an interesting coaching conversation too, because if we're not allowing some of this exploratory learning with someone, are we potentially limiting some of their control, right? So they don't have that ability to shoot the jumper, within this position through there. If it's very constrained to a negative effect, to where you're constantly providing feedback and there's no opportunity for the athlete to kind of learn or kind of figure out what works and what doesn't, I think that's where we get into this discussion on, how much bandwidth is enough. I think if you constrain tasks early on to the point where you're not allowing any sort of variation within, I think that's what sets someone up for trouble in terms of lacking that variability down the line.
Yeah. Well, we think of a free throw as a very constrained task. It's the same distance from the goal. You're not going to jump. But if you learn how to shoot a free throw, that may have some transfer to shooting the ball at other aspects of the court, but it doesn't teach you how to shoot over a defender. It doesn't teach you how to come off a screen and shoot. It doesn't teach you how to shoot a three from the corner or from the block. It doesn't teach you to shoot a layup. So you think about it like that, this concept applies to whatever task you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I kind of hear sometimes, battled about as a negative to like a constraints-led approach, or kind of more of like ecological dynamics, to where like, oh, well, you can't read until the alphabet, right? Or your letters. But movement's different because we don't have, strict correct or 2 + 2 = 4 scenarios. It's much more exploratory based, and there's a number of different right solutions. So I think that is kind of unfounded criticism in a way.
Oh, we got to get some of these questions. I agree with you, by the way, Kevin. That was a good point. We got a lot of them. Okay. I'm going to let Nathan talk. Nathan, you should be on.
Hello.
What's up, buddy?
Hey, two things. One, I thought, well, actually three things, just to respond to Kevin real quick. I think it's pretty tricky, like in jiu-jitsu, if you're trying to teach an arm bar or, I mean, an Olympic clean or a jerk, nobody's ever going to self-organize that without some constraints or in the beginning. So it's a difficult balance to strike, and the border between too much constraint and too little is probably gray in case specific. But I thought a really good example that I wanted to share about either variability being too much or too little is with regards to running shoes. The state of the literature and sort of expert opinion, as I understand it, is that it's good to have run in multiple types of shoes throughout the week, and then that reduces injury. So that would be an example of movement variability being beneficial, but if you run in one type of shoe and then transition to another type of shoe without appropriate graded exposure, that would be bad movement variability.
Too much change, right? Too much variability all at once.
Right. So just a interesting example to play with. And then the last thing was more of a question that I couldn't formulate into a concise question for the Q&A. What I understand is that people are saying that advanced athletes have more variability. And if you looked at a basketball player, an expert basketball player throughout a game versus a novice, maybe it would appear that they have more variability with shooting, but do they, in a constrained task, do they actually have more variability, or is it just that during the game, they're more fluid?
So we got to go back to the endpoint versus coordinative variability conversation. So remember the pistol example. The expert pistol shooters had decreased variability when it came to the movement of the barrel, but they had increased variability when it came to some of the proximal movements, as in they were moving more, or that every time they shot, their shoulder and elbow were kind of in different positions, but they were able to steady the barrel. That's actually probably what they used to steady the barrel. Think about an expert blacksmith. They're able to get the point of contact the same every time, but they don't swing it the same. So what an expert has figured out is the parts of the movement that essentially that variability needs to be constrained. They've figured that out. Now they've got all the freedom to be creative with the other things that allow them to adapt to a changing environment.
Okay, that actually really helps me understand. And then also, I like that you go to a blacksmith analogy. That really
that's just what Nikolai Bernstein from 1930. That's his analogy: repetition without repetition. So just Google that and Google image repetition without repetition, and you'll see a blacksmith doing this with a bunch of circles. I didn't make it up.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. So like I go back to the basketball. Like again, if you hold the basketball in different ways and you follow through differently, that's probably going to be your bottleneck. Michael Jordan's shot kind of looks the same, but he's doing lots of different things. He gets there differently.
Same thing like pitching or throwing, like their strike, they're going to be much tighter with the balls that they're throwing. So they found somewhere where, the release point's the same, it's consistent every single time, but there's just different ways of kind of getting to that consistent release point.
Holding the ball differently to get different play. So, okay, again, we got great questions, and a lot of them are coming down to some of the nitty-gritty questions like, okay, well then let's just train into valgus. I love it because those are the most fair questions that we need to have. But I'm going to unmute Jason.
Scott Morrison's screaming adaptive capacity right now.
I know.
Hey guys, can you hear me there?
Yes, sir.
This is my first time joining the Journal Club, so thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed listening to you guys and hearing a lot of the different point of views. So I actually work in tennis on the ATP, and as a physiotherapist, I'm from Australia. And one of the things that I see out there on tour is all this sort of stuff is great, and I'm a big fan on being prepared in the gym. So making sure that you can handle the load in an unfamiliar environment, and that's going to be when you're on court, you're fatigued. There's so much different stimulation and things that are thrown at you like that. But one of the things that I think as coaches, as physios, strength coaches, stuff like that, is to understand at the top level, how did that athlete get there already? And to be careful with the interventions we do, because we can change things in the gym that we think is going to have a positive effect on their movement variability and their load tolerance and all these things. But in some cases, you're going to have coaches of that athlete that will say, well, I'm working with a top 20 player in the world and they've got to this level. How can you come in and tell me that they need to do this type of exercise, or they need to load more in this way, and that's going to actually detract from what I want to achieve on court or in different ways? And I think as health professionals, as strength coaches, physios, it's something that from a clinical relevance standpoint, we have to take that into consideration as well.
Oh man, think of a sprinter. Like most of the sprinters, the high level sprinters that I've worked with, which has not been that many, most of them can't bend forward past their knees, or like they're not very bendy, but they're top level. And I will be damned if I try to make them more flexible and concurrently make them slower.
Yeah.
I mean, I've gone back and forth on this because this gets into this discussion that we always kind of beat around the bush on this, but like how much variability is enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I've also come to the point where I don't know if, some of the strategies or the things that we're implementing in a rehab or a performance setting really actually have enough transference to make much of a difference when we're talking about a high stress environment. So by implementing some of these, strategies or drills, whatever you want to call them, to increase variability, I'm not convinced that it's actually going to necessarily change the way that they're performing within their sport, just because the constraints are different. We can't replicate the task or the environment. So I don't know. I've kind of gone back and forth on that, and I still don't have a.
Yeah, I agree with you. The thing that I would say with that is, like, all these types of things, I think they need to be a multidisciplinary approach, and it needs to be very much goal driven. And like, I had a coach on the ATP say to me, okay, so you're looking at Djokovic right now and we're watching him practice. Like, you look at the way that his biomechanics are, and then you look at someone like Roger Federer, and then you look at Nadal, and like, all these guys have totally different like makeups and the way that they play. But like, when it comes to movement variability, I feel like they all have the same end. Like, it doesn't matter how they swing back, it doesn't matter whatever, they all have like what you may, I love the analogy of the gun. Like, the best guys, it doesn't matter what they do with their shoulder, their elbow, all these different degrees of freedom. At the end, when they pull that trigger, they're in the same spot.
But Jason, what would you say is, so we know with experts then or no, we don't know, but the Hamel paper is saying with experts that endpoint variability is decreased, but like what you said, the coordinative variability is increased. So that's, I think, what you're getting at. But What would you say is the endpoint? Like, all of these guys, they're doing the same thing at the end, like
at impact. So like, I had a golf coach, because I used to do stuff on the LPGA, and he would say, if you look at all these different golf swings, doesn't matter where they are on their backswing, at impact, they're all pretty much the same. So at that downswing point, at impact, before they hit that shot, like, if you look at the error or how much displacement there is, it's very, very minimal at endpoint.
Interesting.
That's just from my own experience. I don't know if you guys.
Oh, it makes sense. I mean, from the injury conversation is simply, I think the injury conversation is almost implicitly needs to have a disclaimer. Not necessarily the best way to maximize performance by trying to explicitly increase the movement solutions.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead.
No, I was just
Oh,
going to
okay.
say thanks for giving these papers. I think it's really good, and I'm excited to hear what other people have to say and learn from you guys. So thanks for having me along.
Thanks for your input. That was great. Well, I'm going to read off some questions here from some peeps. I muted myself. How does this account for simple tasks that have a high percentage of success as well as high degrees of variability? E.g., picking up a pencil from the floor can be accomplished in a large variety of ways. Is this what you were talking about when you discussed endpoint versus coordinative? Well, kind of, but the complexity of the task makes it so that it really doesn't matter how you do it. And also the load and the stress that's involved. So the load of the pencil and the load of gravity isn't high enough of a stress for that to constrain how many solutions that you use. So really, then it's just about an individual constraint, like, oh, I literally don't have the ability to bend like that or something. But if you're just a healthy person, when it's a task that low stress and that low in complexity, you're right, the variability is through the roof, and it doesn't matter because performance is kind of dichotomous. Yes, no, I did it.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially like the big takeaway from the third paper looking at, I forget the lead author on it, but it was just that movement options condense as task stress rises.
Now let's talk about the valgus thing. So I talked about different lunges and these types of things. I think it's a fair question to ask then. Are you saying then one of those lunges have their knee go in a little bit? Have them do weird shit, essentially, because they're going to be subjected to that on the field. I'm still having a hard time because I know I said different options, but in all of those options, you're still kind of pushing into the floor with your whole foot. Like I'm still of the opinion at this moment that you can get these sport-specific sport vectors and force vectors. You get those by playing the game and playing the sport. And you use the weight room to overload the tissues in a way that will overload them and like kind of and transfer to some biomarker. And the thing with valgus is that it's not a strong position. So your ability to load that, to progressively load it, Jason, I think, mute yourself, Jason.
Oh, sorry.
Shit's happening. Okay.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I think like one of the conversations I had with a coach, I said, listen, I'm not here to tell your athlete what they need to do on the court. What I'm here to do is make your athlete stronger, more durable, so that they can withstand the different environments and the different demands that you want from them. Like I know that there's some coaches and strength coaches, physios, that in the gym they'll say, well, I want you to move like this on the tennis court, so I'm going to make you do an exercise that looks exactly the same as it. And I don't think you can actually load up the movement strong enough in those positions. Like I think you get that from playing.
And see too, like also we know, I think a squat in valgus and a lunge in valgus is a cop out because that's not how you tear your ACL. You tear your ACL with a lock knee. So if you want to go all in on this, then you do drop jumps with a straight knee and valgus and then train that way. If you're looking for adaptive capacity on the ACL, you have to do it that way. And who's got the balls to do that? So it's like what end?
Yeah. The other thing I'd say is like from like a standpoint in load monitoring and stuff like that, it's very hard to objectively measure how much load is going through if you're doing a bunch of different exercises that are just trying to look like the sport. And how much transfer does that actually have? I'm not convinced.
And testing. So yeah, people might mistake this for saying, oh, testing should be variable. No, that defeats the purpose of testing. So
exactly.
If you have KPIs and reliable tests in place, then you can experiment and intervene with some of this stuff maybe and see if it moves the needle on some of those things. Now, was it that thing that move the needle on the KPI, who knows on that. But if you don't even have reliable testing means or some way to anchor your results, then I agree with you. Now it just becomes like a free for all. Like, where does the weight room, what's the point of the weight room even? Like, you might as well just practice different variations of the sport.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like just kind of thinking about it from like a broad perspective, we're utilizing the gym and the weight room to develop or target constraints of the individual. And I don't think that anyone is, saying that, well, the constraint of this individual is that their ACL lacks integrity, so we're going to purposely put them in this injurious, pattern of movement because that's what their real issue is. To me, that doesn't make any sense to me. We're targeting things like, rate of force development. We're targeting things like peak force production, reactive strength indices and things like that. That's something that I think we can purposely target in the weight room. And it makes much more sense to me framing it from that way, as this is the biomotor adaptation that they are currently limited in. It's not specific tissue integrity.
We got a couple good questions on external cueing, because I think this idea of variability and then kind of letting the athlete explore within the boundaries that we've set as coaches and clinicians, just kind of based on what we feel the movement should be. Like, we're giving them some wiggle room in the way that they perform the task, but not so much wiggle room where it just is like, literally do whatever you want with these weights in your hand. So one of the questions was, I think that example of the pistol shooting makes sense. Is from Terry. It makes sense why external cues might work better than internal cues. You don't let the gun move versus some external cue. Yeah. So like, if you're shooting and you're like, okay, hold your hand really steady. And you're like, okay, shit, hold your hand. But if you attune, because what you're attuning internally, that's what an internal cue is. And a lot of times that makes the system rigid, and you'll actually see the athlete kind of tighten up a little bit. Whereas if you attune to the external environment, which is external cueing, you say, okay, that's what aiming is, right? You try to line up the barrel with something in the environment. Now they're not thinking about their body. Their body is just organizing itself to get the task done. You're interacting with the environment in that way. So you could say the same thing with shooting a basketball, where you put your hand here, you put your elbow there, and now you're thinking about your shot. Well, there's so much cognitive demand, and there's time with that too, where you're thinking about the ball in relation to the rim. You're looking at that relationship, and now your body, you can give some guidance, but your body can kind of self-organize. So I think that's what people are getting at here. And I think there's something to that within this conversation of variability and letting the athlete kind of explore. And Laura follows that up with, do you guys think providing athletes with external cues gives them ways to develop more internal cues on how to vary their movements, landing, changing direction, etc.? Because the goal is for them, their bodies, to develop strategies to safely initiate and execute movements to minimize injury or to maximize performance. Yeah, I don't know if it helps them internally cue. Like, I don't think it attunes them internally. I just think it allows them to kind of figure out what strategies work the best. And that happens to be a certain coordination pattern that they can replicate more or less, to some degree. And then they just kind of figure that out intuitively, and they subconsciously discard those patterns that don't seem to work. But I've watched the video now a few times of Tyrann Mathieu tearing his ACL. I had mistakenly said it was when he was at LSU. It was actually when he was playing with the Cardinals. But if you Google Tyrann Mathieu and ACL, it's not a super nasty video. So if you're squeamish about those things, but it's a really good example. Tyrann Mathieu is an all-pro. He just won a Super Bowl. He's a safety. He intercepted the ball. And Jason, what are you drinking? Mute yourself when you're not talking.
Sorry. Water. Got to stay hydrated. It's an intense conversation.
Okay. So Tyrann Mathieu caught the ball, and the offensive player, who was now a defender, because now Tyrann Mathieu's got the ball, is going to tackle him. So what Tyrann Mathieu has to do, he knows, I got to catch this ball and I got to plant hard away from this. And what does he do? He does exactly that. He plants his right leg so hard into the ground with a straight ass knee, tears his ACL. I mean, boom, he crumples like a bag of leaves. But that strategy had he not torn his ACL, he probably would have sprung 5 yards the other direction just from that one step. That strategy was probably already, his ACL was torn before he even put his foot down, because that was the strategy that he was going to use. Can you prevent that? Hell no. Because he knows, as a high-level athlete, that's what I need to do right now to get away from this defender. I don't need to bend my knee and take time and then get tackled. I'm going to pick the strategy that doesn't get me tackled. He's not thinking about these things. He's just reacting. It just happened to be that strategy. The ACL is kind of in the middle between the ground, the high ground reaction force, and his body. And that's what gave. That was the weakest link. So we have to think about these things. What can we really intervene on anyway? Now, if you've got a 16-year-old soccer player who looks like a baby giraffe and literally her knees touch every time she does any type of movement in the gym, to me, that's still just low-hanging fruit. And it's easily corrected. And how much is that minimizing risk? I don't know, but it's probably helping a little bit to get her to learn how to transfer force into the ground and stack her joints a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the literature would support that too. It's tend to be intervene only when the people that are really really just god awful. It's probably an area where it's probably worth your time, like you said, to intervene there. But I don't know. It's a hard balance to find between movement neuroticism and nihilism, I think.
Mm-hmm. We try to be in the middle, but it's tough. We got a journal club recommendation for the next one: internal versus external cueing. It might be a fun one. It's a little bit more concrete because we can actually give examples. I've got a lot of papers on that. Jennifer asks, how long does it take for you guys to read a 20-page paper? Yeah, that's fair. Well, and to be fair, I mean, the paper had 3 to 5 pages of references too, so it's never a full 20-page paper. But to be completely honest, this is how you read research. You put away your phone and you put away all distractions and you put the paper in front of you and you make highlights. If you want to make notes, or a pen and paper, but don't close out the thing and start Googling shit, because you'll find yourself in 3 rabbit holes, like without even realizing it. 20 minutes later, you're looking at something that doesn't have nothing to do with the paper. So like highlight stuff in the PDF, make notes on a piece of paper with a pen, and just read the entire paper. If you like chunk that out, it really doesn't take as long as you think. Like you'll need half an hour, but if you have no distractions and you just read the words, you'll actually get a lot out of it. And you can go over it a second time with your notes, and you'll get a lot more out of that, I think, than reading like 2 pages, coming back to it tomorrow. You forget what you read, then you have to read those 2 pages again. Like, what was variability again? I don't remember what that term was. You have to go back. You keep doubling up your work. Get rid of your distractions, knock it out. Half an hour, you'd be amazed at what you can knock out. Half an hour may be pushing it. Some of those pages were like all words, but like, yeah, 35 minutes. What else you got?
I'm kind of at a loss on where to run from here, man.
I think it's a good stopping point. So take home is read these papers. Actually, I'm going to give you guys more. I'm going to drop them in the chat right now, and just Google these titles. If you have any problem getting the full paper, some of them are open access. I'm not sure if all of them are. If you have trouble getting them, email me and I got you. But the more you read about this stuff, the more it makes intuitive sense. And you start to think, okay, I don't need to, some things are just not in this literal sense. This is my movement variability intervention. It's just a conceptual framework and kind of a model that can help you in certain aspects. Well, Leah says, what about the switch from performance to lack of movement variability and neurological disease and the frailty? Yeah, I mean, one of the papers, I think it was Sturgio or Hamill, maybe both, cited that very thing, where you start to lose some options in gait. Think about fall risk.
Yeah.
Somebody who,
Pain too.
Pain, yeah. So if you're older and you have back pain and you trip over something, like you don't have your body, you're kind of a rigid system. You don't have a lot of options for that. And that, they see rate of force development and kind of power development in the elderly as something to work on, get them to be able to move fast again. Parkinson's, yeah, for sure. Cognitive, yeah. I mean, so there's like a lot of layers to it. I still think these 3 papers though touch on a lot of that stuff if you read them all through. I got a couple more titles for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I will concede too that it is kind of tough because it is relatively abstract, right? I think
Very.
the hardest thing is kind of reaching something of substance in terms of, okay, how do I identify someone who's lacking variability, and what do I need to do, or what do I need to implement to restore that or to maximize their movement options? I think that's hard. I don't think it's something you can answer without, an N equals 1 in front of you.
Over time too, right?
Yeah.
It's not just in one context. You have to expose them to stuff. All right, do this now. And I got to kind of observe how you respond to it. And then I got to tweak it, see how you respond to that. And you start to gather some of that information. You can put these pieces together. But yeah, without an actual person and not just a snapshot, it's tough. And I know that we don't always get that in the clinic. Andy, I'm going to unmute Andy.
Oh, hey, what's up? Long time listener, first time caller. Yeah, no, I had raised my hand when Leah said something about the neurologic, and we had seen a paper in our neuro class that talked about patients with Parkinson's that had internal cueing actually showed reduced variability, and I had already been introduced to the idea of increasing movement variability in other populations. And so at first, being a novice critical thinker, I was like, reduced gait variability. I was like, that sounds like a bad thing. And so for me, it was a moment of like, okay, well, we're talking about Parkinson's patients versus performance patients, or clients with performance goals. Reduced gait variability seems like something that would be desirable in a Parkinson's population. So the idea that the paper had shown that singing in their head as an internal cue, which kind of gets into probably dual tasking, reduced gait variability.
Also, I love that point. Thank you for that. And one of the papers try to differentiate between variability and stability. So one of the issues with reduced variability in the sense of you don't have the adaptability to respond to the environment, is you don't have the ability to get the system back to equilibrium after it's perturbed. So like literally a fall risk, if the environment perturbs your system, you trip over something, your system lacks the stability to get back to its previous state. Like, oh, I can catch myself, I can kind of balance myself out, and then I'm right back. So stability is kind of this separate construct where it's variability is a standalone concept. It's hard to get your mind around without also thinking about how you're interacting with the environment and how
That's what we spoke about last week too, is sort of like the complex system approach to sports medicine, is that idea of it's the perturbation from homeostasis and the lack of the system within systems to respond to that was something that we talked about last week too. I think, did we put the recording back up for that yet?
Not yet.
Okay. So that's something that we touched on too.
Yeah. And you make great points. And that's why those models that I showed, even though I said it, that all models are wrong and some are useful, people forget that line and then they see the model and they say, oh, okay, well, this doesn't show this, or this doesn't. Well, that's why all models are wrong. And that's what I've had such a hard time wrapping my mind around, this concept of movement variability, because it's so hard to model it, because it goes in different directions depending on who the hell you're talking about within even the same movement. Shooting a gun, you were increased and decreased at the same time in the same limb versus two different groups, and they're opposites, and then tack on cognitive testing and how the brain affects these things and age and all these other confounding factors. I still think it's worth pursuing. And I think the more you read about it, the more you can kind of embed it into your just contextual model of practice as a coach or clinician. But it's one of those rabbit holes
right.
where
that's why I really like that you said keep it as like a mental model, because all implications of it like are context dependent. So that was the like when we had started talking about it, I thought to that neuro case and how I was like, well, I thought increased variability was a good thing. And then you start to kind of just pick apart the study and kind of the population. But I'm curious, what other areas, performance-based, would you, it's probably more obvious to others than myself, but like where you would want to, like you said, be a constraint-based or reduce variability, like when in performance would you want to like focus on that?
All the time. So it's never one or the other. Like we're doing things concurrently. So right now, if you write programs for somebody, you are constraining things, whether you know it or not. So, I mean, a back squat with a certain way, a high bar back squat is constraining the back squat task, because you're not going to be able to lift as much weight as if you did a low bar back squat. A front squat is not going to be as heavy as a back squat. So it depends on the goal of the task, right? And that's where you constrain the task to fit the goal. Let's say in my world, in the weightlifting world, if somebody's scared to get under the bar during a snatch, well, like a full snatch, there's so many moving parts, right? There's a lot of degrees of freedom and room for error. So a lot of times what we'll do, let's snatch on some days, but on other days, or maybe even the same day, we'll do something called a snatch balance, where it takes the pull completely out of the equation. Bar is on their back now, and they just punch under the bar. It's literally the thing that we are trying to work on. The part of the task of getting under the bar. I've now constrained the snatch into this part where they can practice that aspect of the entire skill. So that's one example. In rehab, we've fucking talked about this example all the time, which is leg extension. So like we want to get that quad back, and we know that person can shield stress away from the quad during a squat without us even knowing it, or during a hop test. They can pass hop tests when their quad index is shit. Well, a leg extension, what does that do? It decreases the degrees of freedom. You constrain the task so that the load has to go through the extensor mechanism. The rebuttal to that very example is, well, leg extension is not representative of their task. But yes, that's not all they're doing in their training. They're still doing sport practice or part practice. They're still doing squats and lunges and jumps. It's just that they're also doing this to make sure that we're ticking that box off too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And as you said, like you're probably doing it already, you don't even realize it. But yeah, I think from like just understanding like theory and how it all interplays, that makes perfect sense.
You guys can probably think of examples right now. If you're you got people under you, whether they're patients or they're athletes, it's like, oh yeah, I remember kind of like chopping this up and making them do this part of the task to work on, this aspect. And that's a constraints-led approach. A constraints-led approach is just a mental model, right? But anytime that you manipulate variables of a movement to get a certain solution, to kind of like hedge your bets and guide the ship in a certain direction, that's what we're talking about. I happen to like it because it just helps me organize, my thoughts. It helps me kind of structure where we're headed and why I'm doing an exercise.
That's the point I was going to make. I think utilizing a constraints-based approach actually makes you be a little bit more thorough in sort of your reasoning. Because, if you, at the very least, that this is my end goal, this is what I want them to accomplish. I think kind of working backwards through that is something that I've found a lot of value in it as well, because it just makes me kind of think through the process in its entirety more so, as opposed to just, I'm going to load a squat pattern.
Right. Because everybody squats, so obviously a squat has to be in the program. I mean, that's true, but all right. I think that's good. Cool. Yeah, thanks for chiming in, Andy. Really, and Leah and everybody who talked and asked questions, and the chat was going during this meeting. That was the most live the chat's ever been. Like, I want it like that every time. There's a way to record Zoom meetings. I've watched Zoom recordings where the chat is part of it and you can kind of see the chat going and people are doing their presentation, but I don't know how to do that. If you guys know how to do that in Zoom, let me know. But we've gotten so many, no problem, Gino, so many things in the chat about external and internal queuing. I don't want to make it official now as next topic, but I think that's a strong contender. What do you think about that, Kevin?
Yeah, sounds good to me. I think
it's a little bit more concrete. Like,
yeah, we've had a stretch here where it's been like it's been very esoteric and
yeah. Awesome. It looks like people got something out of it. Well, thanks everyone. We'll take that topic into consideration. We'll look to do another meeting here in the next couple weeks. Kevin, thanks as always, man. Really appreciate it.
Of course, man. Enjoy it every time.
We will talk soon. Bye, everyone.